Today we have on the one and only Dr. Steven Pelech. We are so thrilled to have you on. I was introduced to you actually through a friend who's doing his medical degree there, and he said, you know what, you got to listen to this guy. He had said you're this really reasonable doctor, and he's framed it as a reasonable doctor in an unreasonable time, and I thought that was just so perfect. So we actually had met just briefly at a conference down in Victoria, actually the rally, and I had a list of from our group. We had made a list of people we'd like to have on the podcast, and I think your name was highlighted and underlined and circled about 7 or 8 times. So we were so thrilled to have you on. And for those who don't know Dr. Pelech, he's quite the figure here in BC and across Canada, but he actually he's from the University of British Columbia, and he has a Ph.D. in biochemistry and a tenured professor at UBC. He's actually the founder of a number of companies. I had found your biography and research interests under the Division of Neurology online, and I was
Mhm.
trying to read them out yesterday in preparation for this interview, and I think my tongue's still a little bit tied going over the research interests and certain medical terms there. So, Dr. Pelech, if you wouldn't mind just kind of breaking down, doing a quick, biography of yourself there, and kind of what makes you a little bit of an expert on medical issues and COVID, if you wouldn't mind doing that, that'd be really appreciated.
Sure, Sheldon. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Actually, I get this asked this question when I'm doing cross-examination in the courts now as an expert witness, and so I guess I'm coming across more as an immunologist, although my training in biochemistry has really been applied to studying how immune systems work. And the companies that I've created, they use antibodies in our research really to understand how cells operate, cell signaling systems, which includes a lot of immune cells. So, but my background in biochemistry really is fundamental in understanding how cells work, how viruses are able to infect cells, and the cell responses to that. And so I've published quite a few articles in scientific journals that include a lot of immunology journals. I was a founding scientist of the Biomedical Research Center at the University of British Columbia, which was an immunology institute. And my companies have used antibodies to study these cell signaling proteins that I'm very interested in, sort of like the architecture of these um, essentially molecular computers that operate inside living cells that allow a cell to respond to its environment. And when there's defects in these proteins, this is when we get cancer and diabetes and cardiovascular disease. So um, I've had a lot of experience making about 1,600 different antibodies against targeted proteins. So the technology that we have in my company, Kinexus Bioinformatics, turns out to be very useful in looking to see what kind of antibodies is it that people are making against the virus itself, the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19. And so I guess about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, the genome sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus became available, and it was published in late January of 2020. And with that information, we're able to reconstruct all of the 28 proteins that are in the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And we made them in little pieces artificially. We actually made about 5,000 pieces of all the virus proteins. And then we took blood from people who've had COVID. They recovered because they produced antibodies that were protective. And so we looked to see, well, what were those antibodies actually looking for in the SARS-CoV-2 protein to bind to tag those viruses so that the rest of the immune system could recognize and take it out. So we actually identified several hundred parts that are what we call immunogenic. That is, people make antibodies against those particular parts. They're very prone to being recognized by the immune system. And we narrowed that down more and more as we tested. Uh, to date, is about 3,600 people that we've tested. And we find that the antibody response that people have is very different from one person to another, but there is certain parts that are very common that are targeted by people's immune systems. So we took those particular parts to create a blood test, which we then applied to trying to figure out, well, what is the extent of natural immunity in our population? How long does it last? Is the response to the virus as good as what we're seeing in response to, let's say, a vaccine against the SARS-CoV-2 virus? And try to answer those kind of questions, and whether or not our immune system that was developed, let's say, from an infection against the Wuhan original strain from over 2 years ago to, let's say, Omicron that appeared, about 6 months ago, are those antibodies just as good against Omicron? So these are the kind of questions that we've been trying to answer with our clinical study. And in a nutshell, we find that the response that an individual has in terms of which antibodies they'll make is very different from one person to another. And we're finding that people that we've tested soon after they've had COVID, if we test them a year later, they have antibody pattern that's exactly the same as what they had a year before, and it's just as strong. And in fact, we've gone up to people over 2.5 years now after they've actually been infected, and we're still finding that they have really good antibody levels against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And I suspect this is because normally antibody levels decline over time when you're not encountering the pathogen, the virus or the bacteria. But I think it's remained elevated in people because the SARS-CoV-2 virus has remained in the environment, and we get constantly re-exposed to it, kind of like a booster shots without having to get inoculated. And that maintains our antibody levels as long as this threat is around. And then I think eventually SARS-CoV-2 will be like a common cold. There's at least four coronaviruses that have been shown to cause common colds. And I think this is going to become like the fifth common cold. It'll make you sick, but it's not going to be very severe, and you're not going to necessarily be hospitalized except
Yeah,
in
right
rare
on.
cases. I think this
So
is what we've
going back
evolved to
actually
at this
just
point.
to the beginning too, prior to even having vaccines available, um, what was the actual threat COVID posed from the original Wuhan strand, do you think? Um, was it, as deadly as they say? Was there a particular, did it discriminate in a certain manner, as regard to different age demographics? I know it's a very basic question, but it's actually after 2 years, it seems to be very difficult to have gained any real concrete knowledge or had a real discussion with anyone in a position who would be able to disclose the information, which is, it's unfortunate in that sense. But I think from young people, we're still very much, just wondering, as you just mentioned, natural immunity, it seems to have had a real benefit, and being re-exposed is beneficial. But from the original strain, and as we saw the mutations, for young people in particular, you know, what did you feel the real risk was starting off with COVID? Was it looking like something that, natural immunity would be beneficial, or we were going to be needing a vaccine?
Well, I think the data was pretty clear right from the start that people that are young, you know, um, actually people that are under 65 years of age in general have a very low risk from this virus. But the younger you are, the less the risk. And it's interesting because we've tested antibody levels in even 6-month-old babies, and they have no detectable antibodies. But what they do have is a innate immune system that works very effectively to take out viruses and bacteria before their body has a chance to get educated with what we call the adaptive immune system. So this will be T cells that are a lymphocyte that is very specific for a particular, what we call an antigen, a structure on the surface of a protein or a virus, a structure on the surface of a virus or bacteria that is usually a protein or a carbohydrate. And then we also have the B cells. The B cells are the cells that produce antibodies that can also recognize antigens. And so as we go through life, with our experiences, we build up a more and more educated immune system, and we don't need to rely as much on our innate immune system. And so when we have these antibodies being produced by the B cells, they'll lock on to the virus, recognizing a portion of it, and tag it so that the rest of the innate immune system can take it out very effectively. So you don't need as robust an innate immune system as you get older. When we look at young children, the risks that they have in getting COVID and getting sick, well, if we look at the data, for example, out of the United Kingdom, they're now finding that 97% of high school students actually have antibodies against SARS-CoV-2, and about 63% of elementary school kids. And they end up with lethality rates, for example, in children. Like, I'm based in British Columbia. We've only had 2 deaths in people that have been actually under 28 years of age, and they were two-year olds that had leukemia, from what I understand. So the chances of dying was extremely low, even over the last 2.5 years for children and for young adults. We've also seen that going to hospital, they're at much lower rates than we see with adults. And so, really, most children are infected, have antibodies, and never even knew that they had COVID 19. And they weren't particularly transmissible to adults, even to each other. Most cases of children that get COVID is actually from adults passing it on to their children, and usually in a family setting. So they were really never at very high risk from the virus itself.
Like, wow. Sorry, we just froze out there for a moment there. It didn't quite catch the end there. Was that with young children you were just mentioning?
Yeah. Yeah, I was saying that young children were never really at risk from the virus in very rare cases. I mean, the main factors for anyone that's going to be more likely to have severe COVID is first, very aged people that are very elderly, but diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, immune deficiencies, people that have these kind of comorbidities are the ones that are really at greater risk of being hospitalized and potentially dying. But when you really look at the Omicron variant that we have right now, the it's probably about 1 in 1,000 people now that get infected could die, and about 80% of those people live over 80 years of age at this time. So it's not really the threatening virus, not only to young children, but even to older people now, middle-aged adults. It's really the very elderly that's the greatest risk, and they have often comorbidities as
Yeah.
well.
And does this kind of leads us to preventative methods that we really heard nothing for preventative methods in British Columbia and across Canada,
Hmm.
really across the world it seemed, just regarding a few other outlier countries. It seemed to be that people were going to the
Yeah.
hospital all of a sudden, and
Mhm.
you would need an ICU, or you need a ventilator. You need to be in the ICU and need a ventilator, and that was kind of the treatment essentially. You get tested, as to the test being even all that accurate. That's a kind of a whole other discussion. But just with preventative methods, is this common to have seen? We had heard about ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and even vitamin D seemed to be at one point kind of
Mhm.
a wacky theory. I mean, was this common to see during a pandemic to have no pre-existing or no preventative methods and measures in place?
Yeah, these raise very important questions. So in answer to your question about, well, why is it that the treatments after 2.5 years haven't been more advanced? Why do we go initially to waiting till people get blue in the lips from being sick and then go to the hospital and get their first actual treatment for COVID-19? And then what kind of treatments were we giving them? There's so much evidence, as you've alluded to, with ivermectin, that this is actually quite effective. And a lot of the studies that have been done that have tried to refute, or at least indicate that it's not effective, there's very few of those studies. And in fact, now that we take a closer look at them, like the Together study, for example, that was conducted, as a Canadian study was conducted in Brazil. Now that we look at the data, when we can get it, because as it turns out, the authors of the study, they actually haven't released the data, even though they're supposed to do this. They 6 months before they actually published the results, they made the claim that the ivermectin doesn't work, and then nobody could see the data. Now the paper was just published a few weeks ago. We can see all of the problems with that study, and I could go on for a whole interview just about that alone. But it underlies that there's been a real reluctance to take some of these very promising off the shelf drugs that are very effective for other uses and, in fact, very safe, like ivermectin is, and not really develop them to see their potential for treatment of COVID-19. Doctors have had to do this more or less on their own. And as it turns out, health agencies like the Health Canada or the Food and Drug Administration in the US, they don't say that these things don't work. What they say is that they want to see a clinical study that's double blind, that is um, registered, that they have the outcomes that justify that this actually works. The problem is these are very expensive studies to do. They take a long time to do, and no pharmaceutical company is interested in sponsoring a trial for a cheap drug that's off patent. And so that hasn't come. Instead, those companies have been focused on developing new drugs that that may be able to to meet that need. So, for example, Paxlovid has been produced by Pfizer, and this is apparently a very effective drug for treatment now that just got released a few months ago, and it's very effective as inhibiting a protease that's necessary in order for the virus to enter inside cells. So it can be given as an early treatment. It's supposed to be given for about 5 days. It costs about $600. Except now that we're getting more trials with, or more that's been approved, at least under emergency use authorization in the U.S., what we're seeing is that you have breakthrough cases where you don't actually get rid of the virus. You bring it down, and then when you stop the medication, it starts rebounding. So it looks like you need about 10 days treatment for this drug, probably at twice the price. And let's face it, if you're taking the drug treatment for 12 days for a infection that typically lasts about 5 days, you kind of
Yeah.
wonder what's the point here, right? So so that's where we're at. There's a few drugs that do seem to be recently approved that might work. The monoclonal antibody therapies have turned out to be completely useless because they've all targeted early on the receptor binding domain of the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And so when you have antibodies that are binding specifically to that, these monoclonals, then when your virus evolves and you now have Omicron with changes in that receptor binding domain, none of those antibodies work anymore. And so that therapy has been kind of not so effective. And then, the vaccines are supposed to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infections. That's the only thing that's really been evaluated in clinical trials that are controlled with placebo groups. People have to understand that in the original clinical phase 3 trials for the Pfizer, the Moderna, any of those products, they do not assess whether or not they reduce transmission of the virus or even necessarily the severity of if you do get infected, that the severity is reduced, that your deaths are reduced. That's never been formally evaluated in clinical trials. Those clinical trials have only been set up to determine whether or not you will reduce your chances of getting COVID-19, being infected with the virus, and getting sick. And of course, we now know from the data that's abundantly clear that even if you've been triple vaccinated, you can still get COVID 19. You still have a viral load that's the same as someone who's not been vaccinated, gets COVID 19 for the first time. And the duration of that sickness that you have, whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, is actually not that much different. From the studies I've seen, it may be about half a day difference in the recovery times with Omicron. So then you have to really ask yourself, well, what's the point in continuing with your fourth shot, or soon for some people their fifth shot? Um, and now what we're seeing is that there's mounting evidence that actually the more that you're vaccinated, the more likely you're actually going to get reinfected with the virus. So this is something that we're trying to understand what's the mechanisms that we actually seem to be reducing our natural immunity that we would have against the SARS-CoV-2 virus by getting vaccinated. I mean, this is completely contrary to the information that's being conveyed to us why it's necessary to keep getting booster shots. We actually may be making the situation worse in people.
Yeah. And did this, come about really essentially because from what I understand that we are essentially in stage 3 of human trials with the
That's right.
vaccine. I don't know, is that correct? And is that a normal thing to have mass produced and mandated a vaccine that's only in stage 3 of
Yeah,
human
so you're talking
trials?
about clinical phase 3 trials, and you're absolutely correct. For example, the Pfizer trial isn't scheduled to end till around July 2023, so at least another year into that trial, and it's to determine long-term safety and efficacy. See, the way drug approvals normally happen is that you complete your phase 3 trials, and then you get approval, and then it goes on the market, and then you do further safety monitoring in what we call phase 4 trials. In the case of these vaccines, they've actually, it's pretty amazing. We actually have animal trials that were ongoing with the phase 2 human trials, and those animal trials were actually kind of preclinicals, we call them, when they're before it's in people. Normally, the preclinicals are done first, then you go to healthy adults and make sure that there's no safety issues with the 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 vaccine or the drug that you're going to use, and then you go to people that are at risk and you determine what's the optimum dose of that. That's phase 2 trials. And then phase 3 trials are your large scale trials. They usually go on for many years. Typically, it's about 10 years to develop a vaccine. From the start of what you think is your promising drug or vaccine to when it eventually gets through the phase 3 human trials for the first time approval for um, the mass public. Now, the reality is that in the midst of the pandemic, a lot of corners were cut. A lot of these trials were not done, the preclinicals, or they were done very short. The duration of the trials for phase 3 before with the emergency use authorization in the States and interim order in Canada, in a crisis situation where there's no other means medically to treat the condition, or in this case, to prevent the infection of the virus, then you can get this authorization. In the US, you cannot get this authorization if there was a drug available to treat COVID 19. And so this kind of makes people skeptical. Well, if these medications like ivermectin or fluvoxamine, which has been proven to work in clinical trials, or hydroxychloroquine, if these actually worked and they could be shown to work, then in fact we would never have been able to get these vaccines approved in the first place under emergency use authorization. So there's kind of a a mix of events that were all happening together that allowed us to put these experimental genetic vaccines on the market, um, and make them available to people to hopefully um, prevent COVID cases, especially in the people that were at highest risk, the elderly and those with comorbidities. So the whole thing's really quite interesting how it unfolded. And normally, such a situation would not happen for these vaccines to be approved in this manner.
Now, was it that the hydroxychloroquine and the other one you mentioned there, is it that they were tough to get your hands on? They wouldn't be able to be mass produced easily enough for the
Oh,
average
no,
person
no, not at
to be able
all.
to access?
I mean, hydroxychloroquine is used to treat malaria, to prevent malaria. And fluvoxamine is a medication that's used for treatment of certain neurological disorders. Um, so it does have some side effect in this regard, but the ivermectin has been on the market for, geez, I guess it must be about 40 years. Over billions of doses have been given out. It's considered by the World Health Organization as one of the most safest drugs ever produced. Nobel prizes were given for this, like a few years ago. Uh, so it's kind of ironic that we would take experimental genetic vaccines that almost have never been demonstrated to work as a vaccine before. I mean, there's maybe one exception with the adenovirus delivery system for an Ebola virus, treat, prevent to develop antibodies to prevent you from being infected with the Ebola virus. But the funny thing is that was just approved in 2020 in the European medicine agencies in Europe, but not in Canada or United States. But anyways, that product, it's actually never been shown to work in humans. It's only been tested in animal models where they infect them with Ebola because ethically they don't want to actually test a human being with this deadly virus. So we know that you will make antibodies that recognize the virus when you use these vaccines, but we actually don't really know if it'll work in people. It only works about 50% of the time in the animal models. So, and
Yes.
that's the only case I can think of any demonstration of an adenovirus or and of course you have these RNA viruses that the Pfizer and the Moderna are, where we actually are trying to produce the foreign protein of the virus, in this case the spike protein, on the surface of your own body cells. So you're your own manufacturing system. We have no idea what the actual levels of the spike protein are from one person to another. It can vary by 100-fold. Even though you're giving them the same dose of the vaccine, how it's metabolized and used to create the spike protein can dramatically vary amongst people. I mean, it's kind of funny. If you look at the Pfizer product, it's like 30 micrograms of the RNA that's making the spike protein, whereas the Moderna is using 100 micrograms, and so you're getting like 3 times more of the spike protein produced in principle, or even more than that, from the Moderna compared to Pfizer. But then when you go to kids, they're using like 1/3 the dose of the adult for the Pfizer. So now you're down about 10 micrograms, but you're using half the dose of the Moderna. So now you've got 50 micrograms of the Moderna being given to a young child, which is actually higher than the adult dose of the Pfizer that we're giving to to adults. But we're giving this to the children. I mean, how these doses relate to the body weight and the age of the recipient, there's there's no no real clear answer why such a huge discrepancy in amounts. And we do know the more that you produce a spike protein, the stronger response you get, and probably also the more likely you can have side effects that could, in fact, be harmful. So I'm
And
very concerned about children in this regard.
and for children who, we've said that a certain dose, I believe, under 12, children are supposed to get the same. But for a boy who, is 10 and a girl who's 5, dramatically different weight
Absolutely, yeah,
and
and
body weight.
metabolism and
Yeah.
hormonal levels and all these factors. And but even like even amongst adults, a young woman compared to a 300-pound person. I mean, it's very interesting in the ivermectin trial that we talked about, this Together trial. Once you were actually a certain weight, you got the same dose up to that weight, around 200 pounds. Your dose of the ivermectin was adjusted to your weight. But once you got over that weight number, the dose did not change. And yet, we know that people that are obese at the highest weight are at the greatest risk of actually developing severe COVID. So, that's just one of the examples of how that trial was set up. It was actually almost set up to fail. It's really interesting.
Wow. Yeah, it really is shocking. Seems it was just very thrown together in a very generalized sense quite quickly and not changed or adjusted really with much, reason. Um, with, actually sticking to the, if I'm getting this correctly, sticking to the cells and allowing the cell to kind of create its response to the virus.
Mhm.
Um, Now this is how long would it actually stay in a particular area in which the shot goes in? Does it dissipate to the rest of the body? I mean, this is kind of the concern, and maybe if you can help me understand a little bit with myocarditis and
Sure.
these
Well, I
risks.
mean, we've known for a year now from studies that were originally undertaken by Pfizer and disclosed to the Japanese agency that oversees the approval of the drug there. And the same data was shared with the European medicines agencies. It's just that we couldn't get access to the data from them until later. Um, but these are distribution studies that were done not with the actual vaccine itself, which, frankly, I would have preferred to see the data with the actual vaccine, but it was with the lipid nanoparticles that were used in the Pfizer study to deliver the RNA, except they had a delivery of radioactive lipids instead. And that became like a tracer so that you can follow where did the radioactivity go once it's injected into the muscle of the rat, what organs get affected and how fast does it dissipate. So what we know is within 2 days, 76% of the original inoculant that went into the muscle had spread through the rest of the body. And the organs that it accumulated in primarily was in the liver, in the spleen, the adrenals, and the ovaries in the female rats. And the concentrations, like the total percentage of the radioactivity may have been only 1% in the ovaries, for example, but you have to remember that the ovaries only represent less than about it's around 0.03% of the weight of the organ in the whole body. So what you're interested in is the actual concentration of the lipid nanoparticle at that location. And so it turns out that in the liver, for example, it's actually about around a half to a third what you would have at the original site of injection in the muscle by 2 days later. And in the ovaries, it's about half of what it would be in the liver. So there's actually a concentration. Now, the reason why this is disconcerting is that, well, if you have the lipid nanoparticles going and there's no targeting that are on the surface of these lipid nanoparticles, they'll enter into any cell that's nearby that it'll then fuse with and deliver its contents, which in this case would be the RNA to make the spike protein. So you'll actually start producing the spike protein in the liver and in these other organs. And how long it lasts, well, we know certainly that in certain organs, we can still detect the spike protein up to a month or more later. In fact, some reports indicate several months when we're talking about some of the immune cells, like the neutrophils, or sorry, not neutrophils. In the they're they're a myeloid type cell that actually is of the immune system that can travel, and so these actually still contain what appears to be spike protein. We can detect them with antibodies that these have. The real shocker came, I guess, a few months ago when we learned that actually in the liver cells, it appears that the RNA that is delivered inside the cell with the vaccine can be reverse transcribed into DNA. So the genes of your body, they're made of DNA, and they stay in the nucleus of your cells. But when you need to make the protein that that gene specifies, you make an RNA intermediate copy. You can make many copies of the RNA from the DNA at a given moment. And so the RNAs are then leave the nucleus of cells. They go to what we call the ribosomes. These are protein synthesis factories, and they translate the RNA using the instructions from the original DNA sequence to make the protein sequence. And then that protein, in this case with the spike protein, gets transported to the surface of the cells, and it actually is tethered there. It has a portion at the end of the protein that is membrane anchoring, and it actually is created as a trimer of three uh, of these spike proteins that are all interact with each other. Actually, they're cut into subunits. So, but it's a complex that's very tightly woven and very firmly fixed on the surface of your cells. So the only way that your immune system can can then get that information to the B cells and T cells is that intermediate immune cells, neutrophils, macrophages, dendritic cells, all of these different immune cells, we call them antigen presenting cells because what they do is they go and they eat, in the case, let's say, the virus, SARS-CoV-2 virus, they'll eat the virus and they'll digest it. And all the different proteins will be digested into little pieces. And then those pieces will be produced and presented on the surface of those immune cells in context, bound up with immune cell proteins called major histocompatibility proteins. And together, when you have a MHC, this major histocompatibility protein, presented with a portion of the virus piece, and it goes from the site where the infection is to the lymph nodes where you actually have these T cells and B cells normally reside, then if it turns out that one of those B cells or T cells, for example, has an affinity, recognizes that little virus portion, instructed with the MHC antigens, it'll cause that T cell to expand in, like, it'll grow and divide, and you'll get a whole clonal army of identical cells that have that same recognition. And some of those T cells also educate the B cells. And so you'll have B cells stimulated to grow and divide, and again have a clonal line of B cells that are producing exactly the same antibody that recognizes that exact part of the virus. And that's how your immune system develops this adaptive immune system. Well, the only way that you can get this spike protein into these immune cells, these intermediate cells, is if you attack your own cells. And during that destruction process, you generate fragments of your own cells, in this case, probably the muscle cells that took in the vaccine. And then after that immune attack, that inflammation, then these tiny little pieces can be eaten up because they're bite size for these immune cells. And then this whole process occurs. So the very nature of these vaccines is that they require an immune attack against your own cells. Whereas if you were encountering the virus, the immune cells will just eat the virus. It doesn't need to attack your own body cells.
Wow. So these would have serious lasting, long-lasting implications. They really can have very serious implications. I mean, we hear now discussions of, women's ovaries. That's yeah, something I'm not super, knowledge about. But
Mhm.
in regards even just myocarditis, we hear it's really downplayed now and discussed with asymptomatic myocarditis as being nothing to be
Yeah.
concerned of. I mean, have you heard
This
this?
is
Is myocarditis
this is
normal?
incredible nonsense.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, the risk for someone who's under 24, that's male, that's getting the Pfizer shot, never mind the Moderna shot, that that is getting their second shot for symptomatic myocarditis, it's about 1 in 5,000. Okay, and some people have reported Moderna as low as 1 in 2,700. However, this is symptomatic myocarditis. This means that a person has an episode where they've collapsed, maybe even died, but mostly collapsed on the field when they were exerting themselves physically. And 99% of the people that actually have myocarditis, an attack like that, end up in hospital, even if it's a short while. But what people do not understand is that there's also asymptomatic myocarditis. So we know, for example, from college athletes that got COVID. So you can get myocarditis from COVID. Okay, um, it's rare actually to get it from COVID than from the vaccine, contrary to what a lot of people have said. Um, what is confusing, even the people who are saying this, is that when you look at the studies to determine, well, what's your risk if you have COVID 19, that you will get myocarditis? The data that's presented is based on the idea that if you end up in hospital, about 1 in 750 people in hospital will get myocarditis. But if you're a younger person under 24, your chances of getting to the hospital is less than 1%. So you have to then take that 1 in 7,500 and divide that by another 100. So you have about 1 in 75,000 chance in that range of actually getting myocarditis if you're infected. And now we know that even more people are infected that don't even realize that they had COVID. So the chances of myocarditis from the virus is actually extremely low. However, when you're vaccinated, it's about 1 in 5,000 for symptomatic. But in these studies that were done with college athletes, where they actually carefully found out who had, out of several thousands that they athletes they examined in these 13 colleges, they call them the Big Ten. I don't know why, but there's 13 colleges. Well, it turns out that there was about 9 cases of those that actually had symptomatic myocarditis, but they found 27 cases that were asymptomatic because they did these tests to see with imaging the size of the hearts of these individuals and other blood tests, and they found that for every person who had symptomatic myocarditis, there was 3 that were asymptomatic. They had the same underlying damage to their hearts, but they hadn't exerted themselves and had an episode where it was evident that they had the myocarditis until they were actually tested, like specifically for this. So, so I would expect that that ratio is probably very similar with with the vaccine-induced myocarditis to what we see with the virus-induced myocarditis. So that would then place
Yeah.
the risks of myocarditis
Okay.
in young people, especially males. We have a higher risk than females would at that age group, but nonetheless, it happens in females too. Of probably closer to 1 in 1,500. Now, if you have a vaccine that you're giving people in that age group that is already at extremely low risk of injury from the virus itself, from COVID-19, and you have around a 1 in 1,500 chance of having myocarditis, well, that's just crazy. I mean, for example, uh, Ontario Public Health, they calculated the risk of myocarditis was 1 in 5,500 themselves, and reported this for for males under 24 years of age, the second shot with the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. Well, they also had determined that the risk of thrombosis with the AstraZeneca vaccine was 1 in 55,000. And that was enough for them to decide to no longer offer that that vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, to people in Ontario. So we got like more than 10 times higher risk of getting myocarditis in that age group that's younger than what they saw with the thrombosis. And they withdrew it in the case of the one in 55,000, but left it for the one in 5,000 and recommend it now for children, that are over 5 years and up. The Moderna, I think, is 6 years and up, and the Pfizer is 5 years and up. I mean, it's just crazy. Now, what you alluded to earlier was, well, it's mild myocarditis. What is mild myocarditis? What people are talking about is the symptoms that they experienced when they had their attack, and that will resolve. You will have healing, and the person will, you know, symptomatically recover, but the underlying damage is permanent. So what you have this myocarditis is when you have an infiltration of immune cells into the heart muscles, and they're killing those myocytes, those heart muscle cells. And if you kill a heart muscle cell, it's not replaced by another heart muscle cell. These muscle cells do not normally grow and divide and re-heal a tissue like you would have with skin, for example. No, what happens is you get scar tissue for where those myocytes were destroyed, and the surrounding myocytes, they get bigger. When you exercise, you don't increase the number of muscle cells that you have. What you do is you make the existing muscle cells bigger. And then when you don't have a load, you don't exercise, then they shrink down again. And so this is what happens in the heart is because it's lost muscle cells, it has to make the existing muscle cells bigger, and that actually results in a bigger heart. And at first that's protective and can compensate, but when you really exercise hard, with that bigger heart, the blood pressure is greater, and then what happens is you get more breakage of platelets, and that actually seeds more arteriosclerosis, and the heart has to respond to that resistance, so it gets even bigger. So you get this cycle to a point where now the heart, it just can't handle this. And so if you have a person who has viral myocarditis, what we've seen from the literature is that it's about a 20% death rate in about 6.5 years
Wow.
after the initial diagnosis of the symptomatic viral myocarditis. Now, because the underlying differences between the vaccine-induced myocarditis and the viral myocarditis isn't really different, I would expect the life expectancy issues to be somewhat similar too. So, when we've got a disease like cardiovascular disease, which is the second greatest killer in Canada after cancer, and you're accelerating this process, especially in young children, and setting them earlier in life on a path towards heart disease and stroke. I mean, this is crazy,
Nuts.
especially when these children are already at very low risk to begin with,
Yeah, and for
right?
for students, I mean, this is a lot. If we look at university students, athletes, which I was a university athlete myself.
Hmm.
I mean, there's got to be some responsibility held to mandating this for universities. And in many cases, I know with my school, um,
Hmm.
as with the University of British Columbia, if I'm not mistaken, in many cases it was not actually a medical team mandating or calling for
Yeah,
these
it's kind of
vaccine mandates, but rather, sorry, cutting out a little.
yeah. I was just to say that this is the tragedy that the people that the universities are requiring anyone, or even these sports clubs, and that those students or participants have to be vaccinated in order to participate. These are actually putting them at greater risk because this is the demographic that's the most likely to actually get at least have an episode of myocarditis. And so, and yet you want to encourage people to get exercise because that's one of the things that you can do to improve your immune system and to make it more resistant to infection by viruses and bacteria. So we actually did the exact opposite. We encouraged people to stay home, don't go out, don't participate in these kind of athletic activities, and we actually made them more vulnerable
Yeah,
to actually becoming infected with the virus with a bad outcome.
yeah, yeah. Uh, and I mean, I would think, as I recall, it was actually directors. I mean, for University of Calgary, it was the director of the student union who had called for the vaccine
Hmm.
mandates. It was not the medical
Yeah,
departments. And I have to think that in many cases, the media played a role in this kind of call that resulted in people being so fearful that they felt a vaccine was necessary, and it was not in many cases, given by medical professionals, as we saw at least implemented in universities. I don't know if UBC was the same in that sense. Do you have anything to kind of touch on
yeah.
that basis?
Yeah, well, UBC was a very interesting case because, to the credit of the administration, we did not make vaccination mandatory at UBC, but it was mandatory to disclose your vaccine status. And if in fact you didn't want to do that, there was a third option, or you disclosed that you weren't vaccinated, then you were required to undergo rapid antigen testing. They did require it if you're living in residence to be vaccinated, or if you wanted to participate in athletic activities. So, but what ended up happening is we we tested people. We found basically with the rapid antigen testing that there was hardly any cases. In fact, I'm on the Senate of UBC, and we were only aware of one case in the um, univer- Okanagan branch of UBC, where they had a positive ID of a person. This is after about 3 or 4 months, and they couldn't even confirm that that person actually even had COVID because I suspect they did the PCR testing afterwards and it was negative. So finally, I think around February or something like that, after this program being on for about 5 months, the university administration decided to just drop it because, by that point it was pretty obvious that if you were vaccinated, you're actually just as likely to get COVID-19 and transmit it as someone who was unvaccinated. And so just finally common sense
Yeah.
prevailed. Um, but the problem is we still, for example, at UBC, we still have a masking
Mm.
mandate. So even though there's really no good strong evidence that these masks work. In fact, we're more aware of harms with this mandatory mask wearing. We Even though the public health office lifted the requirement for wearing masks in public at the University of BC, we still have this right through the end of this month, and we still don't know when it's going to be necessarily lifted. It certainly will probably come back in the fall because this false sense that these masking actually makes a difference, um, this it's not really demonstrated by the science that's available. But as you pointed out earlier, what really drove this was the
Mm.
students. It was the president of the alma mater at UBC that called for mandatory vaccination. It was the president of the faculty association that was calling for mandatory vaccination at UBC. Fortunately, there was enough um, reflection and part from even the public health office. They didn't really want to have mandatory vaccination in the BC universities, to their credit. And so they defeated, even though the Senate at UBC had voted, I think it was something like around 28 in favor of mandatory vaccination and about 24 against mandatory vaccination. So it actually passed the Senate for mandatory vaccination at UBC, but it was blocked at the Board of Governors level, probably very close in voting. And so that's how close we came to this at UBC.
Wow.
But um, I've tried to introduce, um, I guess, motions from the floor to stop the masking at UBC, and basically I can't even present the motion. It was defeated. I think it was something like around 30 that didn't want to hear the motion and 26 that wanted to hear the motion. So this is just how divided, even amongst the faculty and the student senators and that we have at UBC about this. And as you point out, it's really driven by fear and lack of knowledge. And for some reason, a lot of my colleagues that do know better just don't step up to actually present a balanced view of this. And they just seem to be very much steered that with the mantra, the virus is deadly, the vaccine is safe, and the vaccine is effective. And the data is just not
Yeah.
showing us this.
And that must be so important as a medical professional to be driven by the data and
Mhm.
following. I mean, it's something to say follow the science, but to be a critical thinker in the medical community, is that, I mean, common what we see now in
Mhm.
medicine, or is that more becoming a rarity? And what would be the benefit? It sounds ridiculous and so basic, but the benefit of being a critical thinker for
Well,
students. I mean, you're right.
this is my letter to the president of UBC about this. That my thinking is that we're supposed to be demonstrating critical thinking and expect that of our students, and yet the university, by its behavior of continuing to enforce these mandates of mandatory masking, when clearly it's not being done in the general public, people wonder, well, what do we know at the university that they don't know? And it's the other way around. It's like the university is kind of, in its policies, ignoring what even the public health office itself is professing. It's it's
Yeah.
it's crazy.
I, I remember an island, so our island health authority had
Mhm.
written the president of UBC there and had asked that the mask mandates and the vaccine mandates be dropped. Um, so yeah, I mean, at least I do give Bonnie Henry credit. At
Mhm.
least she did not, force the implementation of the vaccine, and I believe in even a few
Yeah,
instances had
I think
spoken
to
out
Bonnie
against it
Henry's
for
credit,
students,
she
for
did not want
mandatory.
to
But
have the
it was
elementary and high
certainly a tough
schools
thing to go through.
closed,
We saw that in my school out in
and at the
Alberta,
same
and
time,
very. Mhm.
yeah, sorry,
What was that story part?
I was just saying to Bonnie Henry's credit, um, she did not want to close the elementary and high schools. So we had the least closures in the entire country of those educational facilities, and I think that was really, really important. And she did not impose mandatory vaccination, as has done in many of the other provinces in the universities and the colleges. And so I think that was kudos to her. I think she's made some very bad decisions on other fronts. I mean, originally she was against the masking because she herself was very aware of other studies that have been done looking at influenza pandemics, for example. Really, there's decades of research looking to see the effectiveness of masks for influenza pandemics, and there was never any good data to show that it made a difference. And she was aware of that and recognized that. And so that's why even Anthony Fauci of the NIH also didn't advocate wearing masks. It was only after the first wave, and now they were getting into the fall with maybe the beginning of a second wave, that both Bonnie Henry and Anthony Fauci and many of the other um, head heads of public health authorities then started saying, well, we got to do something, and the masks is going to be the solution. But there's such a wealth of data now that shows that it really doesn't work. And even many of the restrictions that were applied, even for example, in the United States, I think it was something like 33 The states had very strict measures, not just the masking, but social distancing. And that another 17 didn't have those restrictions. And when you compare the outcomes in those two groups of these various states, there's no difference.
Hmm.
In fact, it was slightly worse in the states that had the more restrictive policies.
Yeah. Gosh, and it seems that there was really not a lot of cost benefit analysis run on these decisions. I mean, you would assume that that would be a common thing, even just to ensure that there's still trust in these public agencies. Running a cost benefit analysis would be fundamental. I mean, we saw it with, they certainly had their risks and their fears of the result of taking, alternative preventative measures as
Mhm.
to COVID, but like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. But in regards to, something like masking and the, you know uh, difficulties that that could have in learning outcomes and things like that, is that usually uncommon to see, or common to see no cost benefit analysis run at all?
Yeah, well, I think this actually reflects the. Usually, you have emergency plans in place for pandemics. We have these are very well formulated. They were created well before actually the COVID-19 pandemic started, and then basically barely a month into the pandemic, they completely just like dropped them. Usually, you have all these different agencies that coordinate, and they have a holistic view of how to handle this situation, because you're right, it's not just the health factors of the individual or the population. There's economic factors, there's so many others, coordinations required, and this was all dispensed with. So basically you have a unelected individuals that are running the public health offices that are basically making decisions for the entire country, that in terms of, or certainly in BC, for example, uh, what the policy is going to be in terms of closures of schools, of businesses, of whether or not people can be mobile. Like, Canada is the only place I'm aware of in the world where if you're unvaccinated, you can't go on an airplane. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Yeah. Oh, right on. Sorry, I think we lagged out there for a moment regarding
Yeah,
the
we
the
did.
travel
I was
man.
just saying.
Yeah, the travel
Yeah, I was
mandates
just
is what
saying
you.
Canada is the. I was just
Yeah.
saying Canada is the only place in the world where, as a member of the population, if you're unvaccinated, you can't go on an airplane. And of course, this was up in Parliament last week, and it was the Liberals and the NDP and part of the Bloc Party that decided that we still need to impose these
Hmm.
restrictions on unvaccinated people getting on airplanes, when clearly over 80% of the people that are infected or that are in hospital are double or triple vaccinated. It's just
Yeah.
ridiculous.
And it's got to be so tough for you to see that, and if we have
Mm,
another pandemic in the future, and we have so little trust in our public agencies, that's got to be really tough
mhm.
and quite a concern, right? I mean, you're looking in the future and going, wow, this is, near half the country, it seems, has serious concerns and discrepancies and issues with how we dealt
Mm.
with this pandemic, and how are we going to go forward
Yes,
with that?
well, I've had about 3,600 people in our clinical study looking at antibody levels, and I've talked to a lot of those people, and they tell me a lot, and it's clear, as you're pointing out, there is a lack of confidence that's developing in people about trust in the government, in the health authorities, and also in the mainstream media. And when they start seeing these kind of representations that they can see from their own personal experience doesn't really jive with what they're seeing, then they start to becoming concerned about whether or not they trust anything else that they've heard. And we need to have trust in our government and in our health authorities and in our media, because a real democracy works when the public is properly informed. And instead, I'm sure to many people, they tend to be conspiracy theorists, is how they're labeled. And I'm tend to be more optimistic. My own feeling is that the public health authorities are trying to do the right thing, within their abilities, but there is influences, I think, that are, taking a hold of real conflict of interest. For example, Health Canada. This is the agency that's set up to determine, what is safe for us when we have new drugs, new vaccines. And you would expect that taxpayers are paying for this agency to make sure that they're protected in an unbiased kind of way. But the reality is 90% of all the funding for Health Canada for these approvals of new drugs and vaccines is paid for by the producers of those products. So you have a very high vested interest on the running of those agencies and the employment of those people and their reason for being there, that's dependent on them being paid by the very same people whose products they're supposed to be evaluating. So
Yeah.
the conflict of interest here is so immense, and the pressures politically that are going to be imposed too, when you've got, for example, the Canadian government's committed to buying enough of the vaccines already to vaccinate each person at least, I've heard the numbers from 6 to 10 times the population of
Yeah.
Canada. Well, when you're making those arrangements very early on in the pandemic, before you even know that these products are even working that well, I mean, now you've got this sunk costs, you've got this vested, interest that's going on there, and you wonder, well, can you be in certain countries, politicians are being bought. In other countries, look at our doctors. They haven't been as outspoken because their very jobs are on the line. If they in these colleges, if they want to, like College of Physicians and Surgeons, for example, if they want to go ahead and prescribe ivermectin, it's actually not illegal to for a doctor to prescribe ivermectin for treatment of COVID-19. It's not illegal. Okay, and this was confirmed because, Canadian COVID Care Alliance had a petition to the Parliament, and there was a response from Health Canada in that to that petition, and it clearly states in that petition that they actually don't they're not recommending ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19, but it's not illegal for a doctor to take any drug that's on the market and prescribe it for another application if they think that there's data to support that use. And it states clearly in the response of Health Canada that they would actually prefer that doctors prescribe ivermectin,
Wow.
because that way they can ensure that the patients are getting the right dose of the ivermectin and that the quality of the ivermectin is appropriate,
Yeah.
rather than
And
having to go, for example, to a horse paste and use doses that are meant for a horse, because the average person can't tell the difference necessarily between a milligram and a milliliter.
and we must see
So
real
this is
deaths in that.
why,
That's concerning. Yeah.
well, there's been no deaths from ivermectin use
Okay.
at all,
Hear me.
even for COVID-19. That's there hasn't been. There's been some
Oh.
reports of toxicity,
Yeah.
which, as it turns out, when you start to investigate,
Yeah.
are actually were not really true. I'm sure that there is some toxicity
Mhm.
problems with some individuals because a lot of people are taking ivermectin and in large doses. I personally don't recommend it. My thinking is that it may work. There's a lot of evidence that suggests ivermectin could be useful in treatment of early stages of the COVID-19, but I wouldn't take it prophylactically. I wouldn't take it regularly. I think, any drug, when you don't really need it, I would avoid it. I think you have to rely on your natural defenses. It's only when it really needs an assessment because you have a disease scenario, then that's when you should take these kind of treatments.
Right on.
But despite that,
Mhm.
people taking large doses, and actually, there's been very little problems from ivermectin itself.
Fascinating. Wow. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a very good indicator that it most likely is a suitable treatment in some way, or that it's
Mhm.
I guess benefit. I just wanted to ask. I've taken up a lot of your time here, and we were so thankful for it. Um, for you sharing your time with us like this, but I just wanted to ask quickly too on COVID Care Alliance, the organization. One of my last questions would be, what can we do
Mhm.
to kind of start mending some of the issues that have come up in the past 2 years and ensuring that they don't happen in the future. But your organization that you're part of is doing a ton too, and I wanted to make people further
Mhm.
aware of it, especially for young people. Can you just speak a little bit on COVID Care Alliance and Canadian COVID Care Alliance and what you guys are up to?
Right. Well, our alliance was formed a little over a year ago,
Mhm.
and it's comprised of, well, it says over 1,700 members, but it includes about 600 of us, which are medical doctors and research scientists and other health professionals. We have about, I think it's around 18 committees right now, and certainly with our members, we're quite happy to have people join our committees. I run, along with Dr. Chris Shaw, the co-chair of the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee. So anything that's science related, we have a group of about 33 of us that vet documents that are looking at the scientific literature and other media, and trying to get a sense of, well, what's going on, and being looking at critically, and but still open-minded. But what we're looking for is balanced, evidence-based information that they can give us a better sense of what's going on, and then try to convey that information in reports and documentaries that we produce through, again, various committees that we have. And we were spanning legal issues, health and nutrition issues, availability of ivermectin and other promising medications, through to understanding natural immunity and vaccines. We have regular meetings on Wednesdays that is open to all of our membership, where we have guest speakers, and they include people from the pharmaceutical industry that are developing these vaccines. They include people that are in the legal profession, that are looking at, well, how does this infringe human rights, through to ethicists, through to scientists that are talking about, well, what's going on with the monkeypox, for example. And so we're trying to cover the spectrum, and we're trying to engage in particular politicians, the the court cases where many of us are serving as expert witnesses. We're also looking at various um, rallies where where we're speaking, where like podcasts like this, where we're trying to get the information out to people. And so we're covering quite a gamut of stuff. We're all volunteers. No one gets paid for what we're doing. It's really become almost like another job for all of us. But
Okay.
this is a very critical time
Mhm.
where so much depends on doing the right things. And we have a population that's really being driven by fear, that's being propagated by the media, by the politicians, and we need to get back to some sort of sense of normalcy, and also learn from this experience so that we don't make these mistakes again. I mean, I'm very concerned, for example, with the university. We're very, I would say, woke aware. The main priorities of the University of British Columbia nowadays seems to be in dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and these are all important things to do. But um, when you start to create an apartheid in your own country with respect to medicine and vaccination status, and you start to take people's rights away and their opportunities for education and employment, and you have this. Well, this is a just a brand new form of discrimination, and I would have thought that organizations that are sensitive to discrimination in the past would be the ones that are the most outspoken
Yes.
against this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's just not what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
It's the exact
Yeah.
opposite. Yeah.
Fascinating. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So ever your work cut out for you, and we do as well in our group. It's so
Mm.
yeah, well said. That's exactly the effort, and I think that if it was a generalized statement, it would be to limit the discrimination, right? If
Yeah.
fact-based information, kind, clear, concise conversations, and no discrimination, right?
Exactly.
As we would call for in universities, which is what makes Canada a good country in so many senses too, is that we're an inclusive country, right? The idea is it's kind of
Right.
founded upon those. So
Right. We need to
nice to
build the
kind of
bridges, and
bring it
for
back to
those of
that,
us that
and
have
it's
experienced this
very much in
discrimination
line our
for the
efforts with
last
the
2 years,
kind of Canadian
we have to be
priorities.
a little bit accommodating and understand for those people that were more aggressive, and they're coming out of fear and out of
Hmm.
misinformation or misunderstanding of what the situation really is. And I would say that really it's the responsibilities of government officials and the media and the health authorities to be a little bit more balanced and recognize when mistakes have been made, and then push forward rather than trying to stick with the same story that we can see is disintegrating
Yeah.
with every day that passes, that things that we're told turn out not to be true. We thought these vaccines, after 2 doses, that they're very effective and they're safe, and that's just not what we're seeing. We're looking at, like, say, the fourth dose in people. We're looking at now these injuries that are becoming more and more obvious. We're seeing a virus mutate to a form which is actually more benign and more infectious. It's about 3.5 times more infectious with Omicron than the original Wuhan strain. But if you're infected, your chances of going to the hospital have dropped. I would estimate probably at least tenfold from what we had with the original Wuhan strain. I think that the virus hit our country, especially in British Columbia, really early on. I think the biggest peak was the first peak,
Wow.
but because we didn't have the tests at the time to determine whether or not a person had COVID-19, we didn't record it. I can tell you in my trial, 1,500 of those participants were sick with COVID-19 symptoms, and 3/4 of those people were sick between December 2019 and March 2020. 3/4 of everybody in our study, that's when they were sick. And officially, it's really mid March that we say that the pandemic started in Canada.
Wow.
So, but those people that said they were sick, we tested them, and they have antibodies against
Yeah.
the virus. So I know they had
Yeah.
COVID-19.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly when, but that's when their symptoms were.
Yeah.
So
Well, in that case, it's kind of, yeah, it's beneficial that we did gain some form of natural immunity, right? Politics aside,
absolutely.
what is best for is the health of everybody, health of Canadians. That's still primary. First things first in that sense, and then that is what is important. I know it's tough when you get involved. I find myself doing this sometimes too. Is just denying. I have a little bit of anger against public health, and I just kind of want to disregard any kind of measures or mandates. But at the end of the day, there are benefits to something like natural immunity, and we can be glad that people would have that protection. That is at the end of the day the ultimate goal.
Well, well, what's interesting is that the Canadian Immunity Task Force's latest newsletter outlines some of the studies that were done, serological testing. Not mine, which indicates about 90% of people we test have antibodies against the virus, nor what ICOR Blood Services has determined about 90% of the people that they tested that were unvaccinated in northern Alberta, Lacrete, had antibodies against the virus. But no, this is from now the other testing like Canadian Blood Services and that. And so the estimate is that about 15 million Canadians actually was infected with the
Mm,
Omicron virus.
yeah.
You know, That's like almost like 40% or so of our population in just that space of time. That doesn't include their prior infections. Just during that period, that's the estimate. 15
Wow.
million natural immunity. And this is at a time when already most people were double vaccinated in the
Yeah.
country, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Incredible.
yeah.
Can I ask, and I'll just do the last question here. The getting the vaccine itself, does it decrease natural immunity at all? Are we seeing any indication of that being the case?
So, sorry, you'll have to repeat the question because you
Oh,
froze out
my
at that
apologies
moment.
there. So, getting the vaccine there, would it decrease or have any effect on an actual the natural immunity one would have gained without the vaccine? Would that be in any way the case? I've heard that a few times and just wanted to see if that would be true or not.
Yeah, no, the data is really showing that if you have if you're vaccinated and then you get infected, you actually have reduced immunity. Um, for example, there was a study with Moderna that was been published recently that showed in the Moderna trial that because everybody's talking about a hybrid immunity, right? They're saying, well, if you've already had COVID-19, then you should get your shot because now you're going to have even better immunity. That's not what the data is showing. The data shows that in people that are not vaccinated that get COVID, and then they look to see in this study, 97% of those people actually had antibodies against the nucleic capsid protein of the virus. So, because the vaccine only allows you to make antibodies against the spike protein, if you have antibodies against any of the other viral proteins in SARS-CoV-2, then it has to be from natural immunity. Um, and so 97% of those unvaccinated people, when they got COVID, developed nucleocapsid antibodies in that study. But when they took people who had been previously vaccinated and then they got COVID and then they measured, only 40% of those people actually had antibodies against the nucleocapsid protein. So that is one study that's clearly showing a reduced immune response. But what we also see now is that if you're triple vaccinated, you actually have a higher chance of getting COVID infection compared to unvaccinated people. And again, in all of these studies, especially when you're comparing in hospitalizations and that, we actually don't know in those individual studies how many of those people actually had natural immunity to begin with. And so there's a lot of factors also in those studies that were originally done. If you were infected in the first 3 weeks with your first shot, you were considered unvaccinated. Even though you had been vaccinated, even 3 weeks later you were getting COVID, you're still unvaccinated. So that data got lumped in with the unvaccinated people. And studies out of Alberta that tracked for people who got COVID when that were vaccinated, when did they get that COVID 19? And you see a curve where there's a huge peak that in the first day, the risk is actually quite low. And then the second day is double, and then it increases steadily up to about 7 days, stays high. And then after about 10 days, you can see the decline in the number of cases of COVID 19 until it rebounds again, starting in about, a month and a half, and starts to be a second wave. Well, that's where you have the peak number of people that actually get COVID when they're vaccinated. And all of those people would have been lumped in with the unvaccinated people. And so it just completely skews the data. And then on the other hand, too, at the other extreme of age, people who are really elderly, we're finding that if you're older and feeble, where you don't have that robustness, getting vaccinated because it's boosting your immune system and turning on your immune system, that can itself actually cause people to become ill and get COVID. And so then they end up going to hospital and then they're counted as the unvaccinated. And because they're the ones that are got the worst shape in terms of comorbidities and age, then they're the ones that are more likely to die, and so they're counted in with the unvaccinated deaths. So when you start to look at all the parameters, you begin to understand why, for the longest time, we thought people that were unvaccinated were the ones that were at the highest risk. But now what we're seeing is actually it's not true at all. It's become clear of negative efficacy when you start to get your third or fourth shot of the vaccine. And this is data not just out of Canada. It's even clearer in countries like the United Kingdom and Israel, and that the data is pretty
Yeah.
obvious at this
And that's going to
point.
be so important too to look at the data coming out of these different countries as being an indicator for the approach we made or if there would be a better way to make it in the future and that's got to be very beneficial for someone with a science background to be able to access and see these reports coming out places like Israel you mentioned and places like Sweden who had a completely different approach than we did to the lockdowns and the mandates.
Yeah, no, Sweden did fared fairly well because, in fact, even India did quite well. They actually had a huge numbers of like they had very little per capita of deaths until May and June of 2021, and they got this huge peak of deaths. Maybe they figure maybe 400,000 deaths. Some people project it was actually higher. It's hard to tell because when your hospital system is overwhelmed like that, then people with other diseases can also die. But what's really interesting about this is that although it went shooting up, it came shooting down too. And this is a time when less than 10% of their population was actually vaccinated. So that reduction that occurred within a month, so that by July 1st, it was back down to very low baseline cases of COVID-19. That didn't happen with vaccines. That happened basically from the natural immunity that accumulated in the population. Now, what happened is over the course of time, they started getting more and more vaccination in India. And when that happened, that's when their case numbers of COVID-19 rose again, um, from actually in coincidence with the vaccination. And so when studies are done to look at the vaccination in counties in the United States, they had over 1,847 counties there that they tracked. They found that there was no correlation. In fact, there was a slight positive correlation between the vaccination and the occurrence of COVID-19 cases. So they actually saw for the most vaccinated places, they actually saw higher rates of COVID-19 cases. And when they looked at, I think it was about 100, was it 86 countries or 186 countries, they found that, again, there was no correlation between the imposition of the vaccination of those populations and the occurrence of COVID-19. So, I mean, the data just does not support that the vaccines have actually made a difference. And people have argued that, well, now we have more mild cases, less people are going to the hospital per capita. And so these vaccines must be working. But I could argue equally that, well, no, it's actually just the acquisition of natural immunity in the population. And, the Omicron virus in the spike protein is 97% identical in structure to the original Wuhan strain. So that's why when you give vaccines that are actually based on the Wuhan strain, they're effective in at least temporarily reducing the chances of getting COVID-19 after you get past that initial dangerous period, the first few weeks. You get a degree of protection for probably about 3 to 4 months, where you have a reduced, you have that peak of immunity. Those antibodies are there, and they give you some protection. Those antibodies would be recognized in the original Wuhan strain, but they work just as well
Wow,
on the product.
fascinating. That is just, yeah, it's been I'm actually an arts major, so it's been a complete crash course into the world of science here, unexpectedly so over the past 2 years as I try to learn all
Yeah,
this stuff.
yeah.
But I thank you so
Mm.
much for coming on, Dr. Pelech. I mean, what a pleasure to be one of our first guests on the podcast and kick it off this way. It's so nice to actually have an opportunity to have these kind of basic questions answered. And I had to talk to our group there after we had spoken on the phone recently, and I said, you know what he reminds me of is just a real professor, a real teacher, right? Which is unfortunate that we haven't. Um, kind of had those. It's there. We went, oh yeah, wow. What is that like? And we do have some class members who are doing their degree, or members who are in the immunology and all
Yeah,
sorts of different areas. But it's been a real pleasure. I can't thank you enough. So great to hear.
yeah, that's my pleasure. Yeah, I've had like 34 years of being a professor to get it
To get it down
down.
pat. That's great. That's so great. Well, we'll thank all the viewers there, and tune into our next episode. And that's great. Thank you again, Dr. Pelech.